Welcome to The Spider's Web. The Spider's Web is a podcast that weaves together humor and knowledge in bite-sized episodes. I'm joined every week by The Soul Vacation, and I'm Spider Theory. Let's get started. I think I've made a discovery, and I'm not even kidding. I'm not exaggerating. I think I've discovered something, made a connection that nobody has before.
Am so ready to hear it.
All right.
Ooh, you gave me chills. I have goosebumps.
So I know you're not a big horror movie fan, but did you ever see Nightmare on Elm Street?
I have not.
So that's the one with Freddy Krueger. Do you know anything about it?
I do know who Freddy Krueger is, and did he have knives for hands?
Yes, that is him.
Okay.
And the idea is that he could kill you in your sleep. He went into your dreams, gave you nightmares, and if you died in the nightmares, you would die in real life.
Just pause there for a second.
Yes.
Did you ever have that feeling? Did you think if you were going to die in your dream that you were going to die in real life? Because I've had that thought before, and I've never seen that movie.
I have had, as a child and teenager, very, very scary nightmares that I thought I was going to die in the nightmares, but I've never in waking life, I don't think, been afraid that I would actually die if I died in my sleep. And that was something that people would they're like, oh, it's like a urban legend. You die in your sleep, you die in real life. I've had plenty of dreams where I've like jumped off buildings or like, ever been driving in a car in your dream and it goes off of a freaking cliff?
Yes. Yeah. Mine was the opposite. I was going up a cliff, and then obviously you fall backwards because at a certain point you can't keep going.
Yes. Driving up an impossibly inclined. Yes. I was surprised to learn that Nightmare on Elm Street was based off of a real story.
Plot twist.
Plot twist, and we're gonna get into it. The story was inspired by an article about a Cambodian family that had come to America to escape mass genocide in the killing fields. He had a young son. He was having nightmares, and they were so terrible that he would refuse to sleep. He would refuse to go to sleep. And eventually the parents were like, you gotta go to sleep. And he was so exhausted that he finally did fall asleep. That night, the parents heard him screaming at the top of his lungs, and he was having a night terror, and by the time they got in there, he was dead. And then in the early 1980s, there was a string of mysterious deaths among the Hmong refugees. There was 117 people who died. They would die in their sleep, and no one knew what was going on. They seemed relatively healthy. They couldn't tell that they had any diseases, that anyone had poisoned them, that it was any foul play. It was completely sudden. They didn't know why or what had happened. And so I'm looking into this, and I thought it was interesting that we have this story about these Cambodian refugees, and it happened to their family. And then we see that it's happening to these Hmong refugees, 117 of them. And then I wanted to look at what was actually going on. Had they ever figured out what this was? And so what they think was happening was something called sudden unexpected nocturnal death syndrome, or it's also called Brugada Syndrome. And basically it is a type of heart issue that comes on suddenly, and you have like arrhythmias in your sleep, and you can just die in your... It's kind of like sudden infant death syndrome, but for adults.
Wild. It
mostly happens in men and young boys. And, you know, from there, I wanted to read a little bit more about it. So I went to the Wikipedia page, and when you start to read about the studies that have been done and where the populations that they could see this cropping up in, you start to see some really interesting patterns. So obviously this can happen wherever, right? But they seem to find that it's happening more often in Southeast Asian countries, but also in certain demographics. And I find this really interesting. So On the Wikipedia page, one of the first demographics they talk about are Southeast Asian immigrants who were fleeing the Vietnam War. So we have Cambodian refugees, we have Hmong refugees, we have Vietnamese people fleeing the Vietnam War. Then they look at Filipinos in Hawaii. And I was like, why specifically Filipinos in Hawaii? They're seeing this happen to Filipinos in Hawaii. So I was like, okay, I don't know anything about that. So I Googled Filipinos Hawaii, and it's interesting. Between the early 1900s and the 1940s, Hawaii shipped in Filipino people to replace the Japanese people on the sugar plantations. And by Hawaii, I mean the colonizers who were in Hawaii. They start shipping in Filipino people to replace the Japanese people that they were enslaving on these plantations. And the Japanese people had started revolting and striking, and they were refusing to work because of horrible working conditions and extremely low pay. And so they ship in all of these Filipino people to replace the Japanese people working there. And then they segregated them so that the Japanese people could not influence the Filipino people and tell them what they were doing, and so they couldn't join them in their work. And so now we have a population of people who are essentially being trafficked in to Hawaii and then made to work. Like, these are horrible, horrible conditions. These are, I don't know if you could describe that as warlike conditions. It kind of is. That's horrible. And so there's another pattern there. Then they said that this also happens in Cambodian people. Do you know what happened in Cambodia?
No, I don't.
America has dropped more bombs on Cambodia than I think I looked at it, and if you split up the amount of bombs that were dropped on the entire country, it would be 1 ton's worth of bombs per person in Cambodia.
Oh my God.
Isn't that awful? Why is this sudden heart attack, I guess you could call it, sudden arrhythmia in the middle of your sleep happening to all of these populations that are being affected a lot of times by America, but they're in war. They're like, we don't know what causes sudden arrhythmic death syndrome. We have no idea. It's a disease of war. So I'm reading up about Hawaii, them bringing Filipino people into Hawaii, right? And then I'm thinking about, it reminds me of slavery. And then I'm like, why in all of these articles there's no numbers or mentions of the African American population? Where are they in this study? Because I'm wondering if there's a pattern there. Another thing we need to mention is this sudden arrhythmic death syndrome. There is a genetic component to it as well.
Oh, but can we put a little asterisk there?
Yeah.
If we know what we are now learning in modern genetics about epigenetics,
Yes.
and how much our environment influences our DNA.
Correct. Yes.
Is that what is going on? Why they all had a genetic indicator?
Yes, thank you. I'm glad you brought that up, because I want us to remember this. So the genetic marker, the gene is called, if you have this syndrome, the mutation of gene SCN5A is affected, okay? Remember that gene name, because I was reading all about this. I see that gene name and I forget about it. And then I'm reading up about the Filipino people in Hawaii, and then it makes me think of slavery in America. And so I wanted to see, because this Wikipedia article isn't looking into that. They're not looking into the African American population. And so I wanted to see if there was some sort of correlation. So I start looking into heart disease and racial differences in America. I was specifically looking for sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, nocturnal death syndrome in African American populations, and I couldn't find studies specifically on that. However, I did find African American people are at a higher risk for different heart diseases than white Americans. What's interesting is when I tried to look up the sudden arrhythmic nocturnal death syndrome in African American populations, an article came up about how sudden infant death syndrome is highest in African American populations. And then in the article, it says that when they looked at the genes of these babies, they had a mutation of gene SCN5A. That's the connection I wanted to bring up. So in sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, they talked about this mutation. In this other study of SIDS in African American babies, they found this mutation. If what Soul Vacation is saying and epigenetics is at play, could the heightened rate of sudden infant death syndrome in the African American population be because of slavery? Could that have increased the
yes.
Right? Do you see what I'm saying?
And because that's the thing, epigenetics, what we're learning is we're like, okay, environmental factors impact our DNA. We've known that for a long time. Like we knew DNA was passed down, and we knew that. But now they're realizing that we're passing down that mutated DNA and how far it goes back. And so I do think that slavery is probably impacting those same things.
Is epigenetically impacting people today.
It's fascinating that was the origin story of
a horror movie.
Freddy Krueger, or what is it called?
Nightmare on Elm Street.
Nightmare on Elm Street. And do they talk about it? I know they've made multiple versions of it, but do any of them talk about kind of the origins of the story?
No, they don't. And the movie is kind of, it's more disturbing and kind of almost takes away from all of this. Someone should make a separate movie about this that's more serious.
Yeah.
Because
and tell that story, and it still could be like a psychological horror, because if you have
it's horrifying
the perspective of the people experiencing it.
Yes. Well, and this is where all the stories of a witch sitting on your chest taking your breath away and people dying in their sleep, all over the world there's names for this, and they thought it was mystical, right? Just like in Freddy Krueger, the explanation is out of this world, but in reality there is an explanation. It's this gene mutation SCN5A, and it could be this could be because of war. This could be because of enslavement. This could be epigenetically passed down from your ancestors who were genocided.
And people who had traumatic lives.
Yes.
I mean, you can even scope it into people's personal lives, and stress impacts our genetics.
Yeah.
And and so then it makes me think that you have to tell that story from all those different perspectives. You have a flashback to 1601, and people are saying it's a witch taking their breath. And you go through telling all these stories, and you end up in modern day, and you're in a science laboratory to figure it out.
Interesting.
And you can still maintain the horror story by telling the full story. And what brings me to my next question, which I guess I don't realize, because just so you know, the Soul Vacation is all about relax and leisure. Not a fan of horror movies.
Exactly.
So I ask you this question. Are horror films social commentary?
Yeah, no, totally. Absolutely. There's a documentary out that I really want to watch, and it's about how early horror is a lot about commentary, and it's a lot about commentary on like LGBTQ things.
What's it called?
I think it's like queer horror or something like that, or but
if you come across it, send it to me.
I will. Horror movies are social commentary, and even to this day, did you see The Babadook?
No. You
got to watch it. It's social commentary on postpartum depression. It's amazing.
I've never seen it.
It's not too scary. I think you can handle it. It's spooky and artistic, and I think you would appreciate it.
Yeah, maybe I'll add it to my list.
You should watch it. Just watch it during the day, and you'll be fine. I want to say one more thing about the heart disease.
Yes.
So I mentioned that the highest rates of sudden infant death syndrome are among African Americans. They're also highest amongst Native Americans, which adds to our theory. So I don't want to forget about them. Thank you for listening to the Spider's Web podcast. You can find links to most of the things we talked about in the show notes. And if you'd like to follow me on TikTok or Instagram. I'm Spider Theory, and you can find The Soul Vacation on TikTok and Instagram at The Soul Vacation. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.